This is JadeCast, your gateway to traditional martial arts and Chinese culture. Brought to you by your host, Shifu Bluestein. Hello everybody and welcome back to JadeCast. I am your host, Jonathan Bluestein. So today we have a very interesting topic at hand, the petrification of traditional martial arts. Now what do I mean by that? For any avid student of martial arts history, it becomes evident quite quickly that the traditional martial arts we have today, the vast majority of them, have a history spanning no longer than 250 years. Now, this may come as a shock for novice practitioners or to the general public, as many have been led to believe that the martial arts that we see today have had a tradition going back many thousands of years, or at least many hundreds of years. But that is not the case. As a matter of fact, we have very little documented historical information about the majority of martial arts. Actually, if we look back at a lot of styles and lineages and substyles, we see only light remarks, off comments here and there about the life of this or that master, what they taught and how they taught it, compared with the study of history in the context of wars, militaries, politics, plagues, etc., we actually know relatively little about the history of most martial arts. So, if we look at Chinese martial arts in particular, broadly speaking, the longest running style, so to speak, is Shuaijiao. Shuaijiao, or Chinese wrestling, is the martial art which we could potentially say has the longest running history in the world, perhaps, and certainly in Chinese culture. This is because Shuaijiao, as Chinese wrestling, is already described in light detail and appears over 2,000 years ago. Now, can we say for sure that the Shuaijiao, the Chinese wrestling of over 2,000 years ago, bears a resemblance to what we have as Shuaijiao today? We cannot be quite certain, but we do know that this is the style with the longest running history amongst all of the Chinese systems. However, aside from Shuaijiao, there is no one Chinese martial art with history spanning back more than a few centuries. That is the truth. I would say potentially the style with the longest documented history might be Chen style Taiji Chuan. So it's a sub-lineage of Taiji Chuan, which many people know as Tai Chi, that originated from the Chen family. The Chen family actually had their own Shaolin-derived martial arts. To this day, Chen village is only about a 3-hour drive from the Shaolin monastery. And so it made sense that the martial arts in the area would often be the martial arts that were derived from the Shaolin temple or that had a similar style of expression to them. And certainly that was the case in Chen village. And their style can be said to go back as far as 400, 450 years perhaps. That is a long period of time, many generations. If we consider that back in the day, people would often have children by the time they're 20. Then in a century, we're talking about at least 5 generations. So in 400 years, we could have as many as 20 generations. That's 4 centuries times 5 generations. So you could see that within the span of something like 20 generations, which, by the way, many people in the Chen village claim that their martial arts go back 19, 20, 21 generations even, then the art would have developed and evolved quite a bit, or so we hope, but we shall get back to that. However, most other traditional Chinese martial arts have their history spanning back at most 250 years. A lot of the Chinese so-called internal styles, such as Xinyichuan and Baguazhang, the other internal styles, as Taijichuan is also one, actually have a far shorter history. Xinyichuan and Baguazhang, in their modern iterations, there are also some older varieties, but I would not get into it. They go back as little as about 150 years. So that's, again, in the scope and span of the entire history of the human race and human culture, that's not a long period of time. And if you look at something like Okinawan karate, Okinawan karate is made out of many substyles, which arrived at the Ryukyu Kingdom, the Ryukyu series of islands, south to Japan. The Ryukyu Kingdom, made out of these many small islands, Okinawa being one of them, from which is derived the name Okinawan karate, were self-governed by the local people living there, the Okinawans, which ethnically were somewhere between the Chinese and the Japanese, as reflected by their culture, their language, and also their martial arts. About 300 years ago, the Okinawans were conquered by the Satsuma clan from Japan, a clan of samurai. And as a result of that conquest, the Okinawans were forbidden, for the most part, for several centuries, from wielding or even owning sharp melee weapons. So they couldn't have swords or spears or knives. And therefore, what we see in Okinawa is that a lot of people resorted to focus on empty-handed practice, and in their weapons training, we see no bladed weapons, at least formally, because there are a few families in the Ryukyu Islands which have secretly preserved certain bladed practices that originate from China, but they're a very small minority, and that's a whole nother story. But overall, we see the primary development of Okinawan karate in Kobudo. Kobudo, literally the old martial way, which is a synonym for melee weapons martial arts from the Ryukyu Islands, from Okinawa. Okinawan karate and Kobudo primarily developed over the last 300 years, and mostly over right about the past 150 years. As a matter of fact, we know historically, and this is well documented, that styles such as Goju-ryu karate and Uechi-ryu karate were only systematized during the 20th century, as were Shotokan karate, Shito-ryu karate, and many others. And one of the catalysts for this had been the rise of Japan as an empire in the beginning of the 20th century, and the very strong nationalistic and militaristic spirit of Japanese culture. Now, you must remember, by the 20th century, the Ryukyu Islands were already a part of Japan. They have been for about 200 years by then. And so a lot of the leading karate masters from the Ryukyu Islands came to Japan and formalized and systematized what they taught, which may have been a tad more disorderly before in terms of the curriculum, in order to cater for the needs and requirements of the culture at the time. So we see, for example, in the creation of Shotokan karate, there are 5 kata, 5 movement forms, which were previously called pinan. Pinan in the Okinawan dialect, which means peaceful mind. But when these kata were brought by Funakoshi Sensei, the founder of Shotokan karate, to Japan, and he wanted to cater for the wants and needs of the Japanese government and their people, which were highly, again, nationalistic and militaristic, he changed that name to Heian, from Pinan to Heian. That's the name of those 5 katas now. Heian 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, because Heian is in the name of an imperial period and dynasty in Japan. And that was deemed as a more fitting name for the times. And so we can speak about a lot of martial arts in this context, but we overall see that the bulk of traditional martial arts today, and that includes also, of course, Taekwondo Even we could speak nowadays of Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu as it is becoming in certain lineages what we could deem a traditional martial art. It is a process, it is in the making as I speak. And all of these styles are relatively recent. Now, that does not mean that people do not possess well refined, honed, and effective martial arts in the past. It's just that the martial arts of the past are not that well documented for the most part, and they were either lost by various historical processes, temples which were ruined, people which were killed, plagues, wars, people just stopping to practice because they had firearms, all manner of reasons, right? Government edicts that forbade them from practicing, etc., etc. Some have just been lost, and others simply transformed over time to the styles we know and familiar with today. Although the process of transformation, unfortunately, is one of the least documented aspects of martial arts history because, sadly, the majority of teachers over the years did not bother to write down and explain the manner in which they changed their style over their lifetime or how it was changed by their own teachers because they didn't care much for that. They cared about the practice and the teaching itself, and they didn't think it important, even though it is, to document those changes and how they occurred. And more importantly, even, why did they choose to change and transform those martial arts in the manner that they did? All right, so this was just a brief historical overview, but now let's get to the main topic, which is the petrification of traditional martial arts today. What I see amongst most martial arts teachers today is somewhat of a confusion in terms of how they need to approach the curriculum. Now, granted, if you are a student, you need to follow the curriculum of your teacher. If you are a beginner as a teacher, a beginner sensei, beginner Shifu, professor as they often call themselves in BJJ, doesn't matter. Yeah, it's still important to follow a curriculum, but there comes a time in everybody's development when they need to spread their wings and sort of explore beyond what their parents taught them, metaphorically speaking. This process happens with us when we leave home and we are no longer under our parents' influences, and this process also ought to happen in martial arts. But peculiarly in the martial arts, we see that in the name of tradition, a lot of people are afraid or cautious about the notion of changing the curriculum of their martial art. There is a sort of an ancestor worship mentality, and which we most commonly see in the Chinese martial arts in certain styles, but even more profoundly in most sublineages of Okinawan karate. A sort of mindset that puts all of the ancestors, all of the former teachers and masters on this high pedestal, as if they were the wisest, most discerning, and understood in the best capacity imaginable what ought to be in the curriculum, how it ought to be taught, how it ought to be practiced and applied, etc., etc. And this manner of ancestor worship is an exaggeration of the concept of tradition. Now, do not get me wrong, I'm a traditionalist. I would even call myself a conservative, not necessarily in a political sense, but in the sense that when I look at progress, I think that progress is something that ought to be achieved, but in my view and opinion, my view of life in general, not just in the martial arts, should be undertaken slowly and carefully. So I am a traditionalist, but I do think that change need to be made. Now, change does not equal better or worse, and the trouble is that a lot of people who do not change anything about their martial art, or do not change much, or do not change the overall structure of the curriculum, they do this because they may have an imposter syndrome. They might feel that they are not good enough, or they might believe, as is often the case, that the ancestors just knew better. And if I change something, it's probably going to be for the worse. And I would like to point out that often in the martial arts, due to the fact that they are arts and not sciences, when you change something, it is not necessarily good or bad. It is simply an expression. It is art. And as long as it works, one has to ask works in what context and whether it works for you and whether it can work for many people. It changes from person to person, you see. If you're a martial artist and you're advanced in your practice, you've been around for 10, 15, 20 years and you practice every day, then you can actually sort of transform the appearance and the manner of practice and the curriculum of your own martial art in profound ways that suit your own mentality and body and the way you like to do things and the way your own personal energetics and kinetics work. And good on you. You really ought to be doing that. That is slightly different in the event that you're a teacher. And then when you change a curriculum in any way, you have to ensure that those changes reflect something that is suitable for broad groups of people, that others can also study, that is not too specific to a certain body type or certain mindset or certain inclination for how one learns new materials, but something that is widely applicable to a wide range of martial arts students, present and future. Because when one changes a curriculum, they have to consider future generations as well. And what we see today, when I say that we have a petrification of the traditional martial arts, is that people are still practicing, for example, the same Okinawan karate that was around 50 years ago. And for me, this is in some ways disappointing. On one hand, Okinawan karate and other styles, Chinese and Korean, such as Taekwondo, Hwangdo, sorry for the mispronunciation, and others, they are beautiful for what they are, and they work if they're taught well, if it's a decent lineage, if the teacher is good, if the student is hardworking. But the thing is, and let me tell you, I'll use a sentence, a sort of an idiom and a guiding principle that was told to me by one of my 5 teachers, Shifu Oren. Shifu Nitzan told me, I think during the first few months when I was studying with him, he said, well, if you practice art wrestling, you practice every day, and you're serious about your studies, and you read a lot, and you consider and you analyze, then for a person such as this, if after a decade of practice, your gong fu, your skill acquired for hard work, looks exactly like mine, then I've failed as a teacher, and you have failed as a student. This was a profound statement, and it changed my life, because he was giving me instructions for the future. He was essentially saying, hey, there would come a time when you're advanced enough to make your own changes, make up your own mind, and see how you can interpret this art for your life experience and your experience in practicing and applying it. It is such an important thing. Shifu Nitzan is a great man. He's also a good friend of mine beyond being my teacher and mentor. And he had a vision of a good father, you see. For a good father would tell his son or his daughter, hey kids, there would come a day when you have to spread your wings. You have to fly on your own. And you have to go places I've never been to. Maybe the places I've been to and my conclusions and my ideas about the world are wonderful. But you have to develop your own. That does not mean necessarily that one has to depart from tradition. You can retain a lot or most of the principles and most of the movements and most of the curriculum handed down to you by your teacher. But you have to consider at some point, where am I in all of this? Am I simply a robot, like an AI in a still body, reenacting the way of the ancestors? Or am I someone who is going to leave their mark on this art form? Because this was what was intended to transpire from the very beginning. That's the whole point about recreation as well. Again, this metaphor. Why do you come into the world? I mean, one of the reasons is that you make progress. You preserve human values. You preserve tradition. You preserve history. These are all wonderful, but you also got to be your own person. And how are you going to be your own person within the martial art? That's a very good question. And if you only slightly augment, maybe 0.5% or 1% of what you've been taught, that's not enough of you expressing itself within the style. You ought to do more. It is actually your responsibility for yourself and for future generations. Now, this may be an unpopular opinion, but I never shy away from unpopular opinions personally. And I should tell you that oftentimes this ancestor worship that I spoke of earlier is actually a form of racism. Yes, indeed. And how is it so? Well, if you are a person living in Israel, for instance, as I am, or anybody living in Canada, the United States, France, Saudi Arabia, Jordan, Turkey, whatnot, and you believe that the reason that you ought not change or cannot change much about what you've been handed over and was handed down to you from those Oriental traditions, because those Orientals, whether they be Chinese, Korean, Japanese, Filipino, or otherwise, just knew better, then oftentimes you're actually being racist, which is funny. It is a form of reverse racism. And anybody pretending that reverse racism does not exist is just a liar. As anybody who lives in North America knows, there is an abundance of people from East Asia who have made themselves a career and often a fortune by the virtue of gullible Westerners worshipping them in this form or another, simply because they are these mysterious spiritual people from the Orient. We all know a story like that. It's all over the news, the movies, it's in books. It's part of American and Canadian culture. It's quite common. Now, that does not mean that this would be the majority of people from East Asia. Of course not. These are actually rather rare anecdotes of very few individuals, far and in between, that have taken advantage of gullible people with reverse racist notions of the magical Oriental. Their eyes look different. They must have superpowers. But we see that sort of thing in the martial arts as well. And in particular, again, with regard to that line of thought, that because they look different, because they come from this so-called mysterious culture, then they must know better. And that is not always the case. As a matter of fact, it is often not the case. And if you were to be honest with yourself and others and look deeply into the history of martial arts, you would come to discover that the majority of martial arts teachers throughout history were, get this, illiterate, and often not past 8th grade if they even went to school. Now, that does not mean that these people weren't smart or wise. Well, one could say certainly, oftentimes they were smarter and wiser than others. We cannot actually draw that comparison, we can only guess. And they could have been smarter or wiser than people living today. But the vast majority of martial arts teachers who lived over a century ago or longer were far less educated than the martial arts teachers who live today on average. All right? Because, books, for example, were a rare commodity in ancient times. Unless you were a scholar, you typically did not have free access to a great deal of books. In Europe, that changed with the Gutenberg printing press. I think about the 1500s that was. I might be wrong. And in Asia, that happened a little bit later. But overall, even with the spread of books, most people were still illiterate until the 20th century. And it is especially true in Japan and in China and in Okinawa. And even those who were literate were not as well educated. People who've gone through 12 years of schooling, and trust me, I'm not a fan of government sanctioned education at all. I'm all pro homeschooling when possible and feasible. But I'm just telling you, even if you went for 12 years of government sanctioned education, you have probably read at least 10 times, if not 50 times more content than the average person would have read 300, 400 years ago. Again, that does not necessarily make you smarter or wiser, but certainly it gives you a broader perspective and point of view. Not to mention the study of languages, for example. The majority of those masters who created this or that martial art did not speak more than one language, and often they could only speak their language. They couldn't write or read it. And many of the martial arts teachers living today know 2 or 3, sometimes 4 or 5 languages. And language is perspective, gives enormous cultural perspective that also reflects on the martial arts, even though that is an entirely different topic. Now we see that during the 20th century, there are certain individuals who did not abide by that sort of reverse racist ancestor worship. We see a lot of fine and excellent martial arts teachers alongside quite a few clowns as well, who have either significantly transformed their styles or have created new martial arts altogether. Look at someone such as Ed Parker. He was a brilliant genius. Now, I would not have taught or have practiced anything that he did the same way at all. My martial arts are quite different from his. My approach to instruction is different. My approach to structuring a curriculum is different. But I'm certainly full of appreciation for his great effort and endeavor and creation. Ed Parker was he is, for those who don't know, the founder of American Kenpo, or also called Kenpo Karate, which is one of the most popular martial arts practiced in North America and worldwide today, and probably has dozens of thousands of practitioners worldwide, and very likely they have spread quite a bit. And one of the main reasons for this enormous success is Ed Parker's not only excellent teaching, but foremost profound skill at the structuring of a curriculum. And if you'd like to study that, there are wonderful videos on YouTube. There's certain Sensei Dan who has done a great series of videos on the history of Kenpo Karate. I'll put links to that in the show notes for everybody interested. And we have other individuals as well in the West during the 20th century. We have, of course, the Gracie family, who essentially created a new martial art, the Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu, originally called Gracie Jiu-Jitsu, out of the judo that they studied, and they still continue to develop it. And originally it was more, you could say, wild fighting and sports inclined, but nowadays, again, over the past 20-25 years, it's gradually becoming a very, you could say, a traditional martial art in certain lineages, not everywhere. We also have individuals, very impressive people, such as Grandmaster Keith Kelspeth from Europe, who for many years his organization spanned 60,000 students up until COVID times, which ruined everything for everybody. But he still has an enormous organization. Grandmaster Keith Kelspeth is Chinese martial arts pioneer in Europe. He is responsible for over 1 million, get this number, 1 million people in Europe over 50 years receiving access to his Wing Chun Southern Chinese style. And he has evolved that style to the point that even though today it's called Wing Chun, one could say he has modified, I'd say, the upwards of anywhere between 35 to 50% of the curriculum. He did this very slowly, very gradually, meticulously, carefully over the span of 50 years, but he's certainly done it. And there's a lot of people like that. There are also, as I noted before, a lot of clowns who create their own styles and don't know what they're doing, which is why it's important, and that's the other side of the equation, that one does not change much or at all about his or her martial art until they are qualified to do so and have enough experience, not just in the martial arts, but also life experience. Nonetheless, if we put those remarkable geniuses whom I named and many others like them, as well as the clowns, if we put those aside, we see that all of them together are still a minority because there is still this process of petrification of traditional martial arts going on with Chinese, Korean, and Okinawan and Japanese martial arts as well. We see it also in Aikido. This process certainly happens there, and Aikido is big. There are millions of practitioners of Aikido worldwide. We see it also in Kendo, even though Kendo is part traditional martial art and part a sport. And my friends, this is a problem. This is a problem because what does not move dies. My father, who's one of the most successful attorneys in the state of Israel, has told me over and over again, a business that does not continue to move, a business that does not continue to evolve, is going to die. It's going to rot away. And this is what is happening to those traditional martial arts of which I spoke. They do not change. And because they do not change, they eventually rot. There has to be movement. Now, all that being said and considered, I want to point something out here, and I'll finish with that. The fact that I'm saying that martial arts ought to change with the time and with people and through the generations, that does not mean that the violence has changed. Because there is sort of promotional marketing slogan that I see oftentimes, especially with some of the Krav Maga people and others, the real life violence people. And they like to say, oh, we need to modernize martial arts. Traditional martial arts are no good because violence has changed in modern times. And that is utter bullshit, right? Well, firearms have been around a few centuries already. And certainly fighting either with your bare hands or with melee weapons has not changed. People have not changed much. The human species, biologically speaking, there is a lot of science behind this. The human species has not changed much in its evolution over the past few thousand years. Some would say we haven't changed much for as long as 10,000 or 20,000 years. It just seems so because of technology and the differences in culture and language and the way we live today. Of course, we changed in our habits. The culture has changed. But in terms of how our mind functions, how our body functions, nah, forget it. We're still the same ape knuckleheads we were 10,000 years ago. Sorry to disappoint. We just have computers and airplanes at our disposal. At this microphone I'm recording with here. I'm still an ape knucklehead nonetheless. And due to this fact, martial arts are today, in this sense, no different. They have to deal with very similar or the same threats, right? Of course, we can go to extremes. We can say, oh, we don't have ballistras and chariots. Okay, they grant you that. But, I'm not talking about ancient military warfare. I'm talking about daily life, all right? And so a knife is still a knife, a stick is still a stick. The monkey dance, which is an archetypal war dance enacted between two ego-filled males that want to pick up a fight with one another. Monkey dance has been the same for thousands of years, if not longer. If you want to read more about the monkey dance, by the way, pick up Meditations on Violence by Rory Miller, one of the best books I ever read. Certainly one of the best books out there on martial arts, Meditations on Violence by Rory Miller. And therefore, it's not that violence has changed and we need to change the martial arts accordingly. Violence is overall, on average, sort of the same. It's just that the expression changes. So it's not that the older iterations of those martial arts that I've spoken of from East Asia, it's not that they're bad. It's just that they don't reflect the spirit of the times, the spirit of the practitioners in their time today. That they don't reflect the spirit of the time, and I mean so in the context of art and culture, does not mean that they are ineffective. It just means that they don't speak the cultural language and the energetic vibes of these generations that we have now. And therefore, they gradually become quote unquote irrelevant to a lot of people living today. Again, this has nothing to do with the clothes that are worn inside the martial arts schools or the language which is spoken. It has to do with the tempo and the rhythm of the movement, the the energetic flow of the style, the choice of how you teach it, to whom, and at what time. How do you have grades in this thing? Do you not have a grading system? How do you interpret this or that technique? The times change around us, folks. We have periods and eras. The years move by, and you see that humanity with each passing generation is somewhat different. And that difference has to be reflected in our martial arts as it is reflected in all the rest of our culture. Now, of course, there are what we can call the classical elements. There are certain movements, there's certain ideas that would always be prevalent in certain martial art and certain styles, and there are concepts that are inherent to them. For example, the idea that Okinawan karate is practiced in part through kata, through movement forms. That is not something that ought to be changed. The idea in most lineages of Bagwajan that you do much of your practice while transitioning between movements spontaneously or in with certain order while walking around a circle. That is a main concept. In Aikido, that there is a unity of I, love, empathy, with ki, which is the Japanese word for chi, and that creates some harmony. And you meet the opponent with this type of openness and empathy and disconnectedness, even if the intention is to harm them. That again is a component in Aikido laid down by the founder. And you would keep that component and concept if you wanted to still be Aikido. But if you change that, it might transform into something else. And perhaps it is not bad that some people transform Aikido into something else. Because how did we get all the styles that we have today? And that is the main point that I wish to nail down today. This is the reason why I recorded this entire lecture. We have the styles that we have today because certain people woke up one day and said, I have the merit, I have the skill, I have the experience, I have the knowledge, and most of all, I have the charisma and the will to create a new martial art or to transform or change profoundly what I've been taught. These people were most of them were not much different than you and I. Just ordinary, everyday people. Oftentimes, they didn't have a job, or they were illiterate, or they might have not been so healthy. You know, a lot of martial arts teachers, past and present, are fat or have health issues. They have all sorts of diseases. We're all human after all. Or maybe they're just a little bit not mentally stable. We all have our flaws. That is all to drive the point that they were just human beings like you and I. The only difference is between them and most other martial artists, they had the experience and merit and qualifications and ability, not all of them, some of them, to create new martial arts. And these martial arts happened to survive. Maybe because they were good, maybe also because of other reasons, but they did. Which means that you and I today average human beings, much like they were, on average, we can also have the ability to create new martial arts or profoundly change the styles that we practice if indeed we have been practicing every day or almost every day and have done so for long enough under a good and qualified teacher in a proper lineage. And so that gives us the opportunity and the legitimacy to create something new. And again, this is our responsibility for future generations.